So, Dan, have you fully recovered from your Memorial Day weekend? That's the question everybody wants to know as they tune into this podcast.
Yeah, I had a great time in the great state of Wisconsin on a lake. I ate a ton of food. I got plenty of sunshine. I got on a boat, like a big, long pontoon boat. Like a great Memorial Day weekend. How about you?
I'm on an incredible run right now of my hot water heater springing a gigantic leak.
The best.
Having a gigantic family picnic over here on the weekend that we had to prepare for.
Did your family spring a leak? You good there?
I think we're okay there.
Okay.
And my air conditioning breaking yesterday. So we're through the woods on that front.
Wait, hold on. Is this your way to transition into talking about Kentucky football by things that have collapsed and broken and been a financial disaster for you?
I jotted down on my note sheet. I kid you not. I kid you not. Quote, nothing relieves the stress quite like talking about Kentucky football, Dan. There it is.
Hey, sorry for the quick interruption, but it'd be incredible if you considered subscribing to the Solid Verbal YouTube channel right down below. That's a lot kinder and more diplomatic than saying, like, speaking of things that blah, 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 blah.
I don't want to do that. We have Kentucky fans.
That's mean. I didn't want you to do that.
Tuning into this. We're going to be joined today by Nick Roush of Kentucky Sports Radio, suggested by our loyal verballer Chaka, who listens to the program and has been listening to all these episodes and suggested Nick. I've been reading KSR forever, and I thought that was a great suggestion. So we reached out to Nick. He was kind enough with his time. He's going to be by momentarily here. You know, I've done these SEC East previews now for the last couple seasons, and I feel like whenever I get to Kentucky, my voice goes up an octave.
Right.
Because I so desperately want this to be the year, or years in the past to have been the year, and each of the last two I've come away disappointed. I felt like there was more out there. I want to talk to Nick about that. What is holding this team back? What does it mean now that they got this big transfer in Brock Vandagriff? Is he a Vandagrifter like you and I? A lot of questions about Kentucky football. Like we had the comments from Mark Stoops last year on his radio show. Then Mark Stoops almost left. There is turmoil within the turmoil is probably a little bit harsh, but there's certainly a lot going on right now with the athletic department and a new basketball coach, like a very, very interesting program that we always find interesting, but I think there's even more intrigue this season.
Yeah. Can I tell you why you want it so badly for Kentucky? They've had a run of players, especially like the weird do multiple things players.
Oh, yeah.
With Randall Cobb and Lynn Bowden, Wan'Dale Robinson was used in a bunch of different ways. And you just have a type, Ty.
I do.
That's what it is.
I do.
And when you see that school that has that type, and I don't know if this is true for Ole Miss, TCU, different schools that you've fallen in love with, that you're just like, I want you to be everything in my heart. I've the best of Kentucky. Oh, Will Levis, you've always had a soft spot for as well.
No. Don't go there.
You hated him at Penn State.
I've had Wan'Dale on my fantasy football team for the last 3 years now. I'm still waiting for Wan'Dale to become Wan'Dale that he was at Kentucky. May not happen if Daniel Jones is the quarterback, but nonetheless, yeah, I guess I do. And I've been a fan of this program. I want this program to kind of turn into something more. I want to find out today from Nick what it'll take to get there, because times are different now. The SEC doesn't have the divisions. The playoff has expanded. It's about to expand again in 2 seasons. Like, as is the case for many of these teams that we've done as part of this Will It Ever Happen series, it seems as if that's a turn of good fortune. There may be fewer roadblocks. The path is wider now to getting into meaningful postseason action. I hope Kentucky is one of those teams. Yeah.
Kentucky's also one of those, I'm talking historically the last, 10, 15 years, and I'm always willing to be corrected. It seems like most schools accidentally happen into a really good quarterback for a stretch.
Yeah.
And Will Levis, I wouldn't say it's a stretch. He had a really good year, followed up by a disappointing year. Part of that on him, part of that just, forces outside of his control. Ate bananas weird and mayo in his coffee, and was like the Will Levis experience at Kentucky was very fun, and the connection he had with Wan'Dale Robinson was great. But Kentucky's one of those schools that just never, even accidentally, had a quarterback pop. And whether 3,000, 4,000, whatever yards, the ceiling of Brock Vandagriff is super interesting to me. The receivers there, the experience along the offensive line. What's Chip Trainum is the one who the back who transferred in from Ohio State. At least from a talent perspective, Vandagriff also has the externally likable with the belt clip and the hair and everything like that. Like he could be that folk hero guy for Kentucky once again. It's just a little bit odd. that since, I don't know, Jared Lorenzen, whoever it is, where they don't have that like big figurehead quarterback for like an extended stretch.
No.
And like you look across the SEC, they've all had that. You look across the country at major programs, they've all had like that guy where like, I can't believe this guy plays for us. And I don't, you look at the Terry Wilson experience and like there's just Devin Leary last year. Like Kentucky just can't find that like folk hero, I can't believe this is our guy for 2 or 3 years kind of situation. And I just, for them, in the same way that you do, like I just want it to happen.
I do. Every year. And it's going to be the same this year. Now, the schedule is not exciting for Kentucky. We can talk about that a little bit later on. But I think there's a lot of talent on this team. I need to do the full deep dive. I'm sure our guest of honor today has done much more of that than you and I.
Yeah.
But lo and behold, when we get to preview season, you can rest assured that I will be high on Kentucky the way I am every year.
Of course you will be.
Every year. So look, we've got, I'm sure, a lot of new folks tuning into this episode as we have all of the episodes we've done in this series. Hit follow, hit subscribe on your chosen platform so you don't miss any of our episodes. We're not the only show that covers college football. We know that. There are a lot of good ones out there, but we do really enjoy the sport, which I'd say is kind of our differentiator. We have the enthusiasm of a small child when it comes to college football. So despite the sport's many flaws, we love it. That's the reason we've been doing this since 2008 and why we've got thousands and thousands upon people who are out there in the verbal.
I think it's just sex appeal.
Could be sex appeal.
I think that's what's responsible for our staying
Could
power,
be that.
But, maybe I'm wrong.
If you're one of the real ones, if you want to join our growing community of college football fans, you can hit follow, you can hit subscribe. You can also go out to verballers.com, VERBALLERS.com. That's our Patreon where you can get ad-free episodes, the bonus stuff, and much, much more. Joining us now is Nick Roush from Kentucky Sports Radio, the absolute gold standard for Kentucky sports coverage. Nick, welcome to the show. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you. Happy to be here. We've had an eventful few months in the Bluegrass for other reasons. But I'm excited because now Memorial Day hits. We turn the page to summer. And, some people, they say summer radio. It's like, man, this is talking season is where we thrive. This is right in the wheelhouse. So only 6 weeks, I think, till SEC Media Days. And then 6 weeks, and then football's here. It'll be here before you know it.
How do you cover SEC Media Days? Just out of curiosity. Like, what's your strategy? Because it's a bunch of guys at a microphone, meetings. It's sort of like one of the content creator holidays in our little corner of the universe. What is your approach to that type of thing?
It certainly has morphed over the years. When I was a 23-year-old, I just thought you just wrote about what they said. But I quickly realized it's more fun to ask other people what they have to think about Kentucky. So I like to kind of yuck it up with the other media hacks like myself, get some takes, speak to those people, so you can get a little bit of both worlds. Maybe a Benny Snell shows up and makes some headlines one year, but for the most part, it's media days, right? They're trying to keep it in between the lines. So you do your normal due diligence, but I enjoy just talking to other people and then stirring the pot elsewhere as well, because there's nothing like the fine folks in the volunteer state when you say things about them, they really like to let their opinions be known. So, we go back and forth. It's a lot of fun.
So we've been doing these episodes now for a couple weeks. We're titling them, Will It Ever Happen for ... We did Tennessee and Penn State and Oklahoma State. It, of course, is relative depending on the program. Will it ever happen for Kentucky? When I ask you that question, what does it mean? When are they going to get there? What is holding them back from getting there?
The original it was get to Atlanta and play in an SEC championship game, which was very close to happening a couple of times. In 2018, they're hosting Georgia. The winner of that game is going to Atlanta. So that used to be the it. Kentucky had the SEC Eastern Division Championship at Kroger Field. It's a packed game. DeAndre Swift makes one cut, goes inside, 60 yards to the house, and that's all she wrote. Now in the new edition of the SEC, it's a much different equation to get there, right? When you're just looking this year, if this was a traditional SEC media days and I wanted to come in with some takes, I would say, ooh, Missouri, that's a fun team in the East to knock off Georgia. And hey, Nick Saban's gone. Maybe Ole Miss does it in the West. You can't do that anymore, right? And those might be 3, 4, 5. I mean, they might not even get a crack at Atlanta. So the it has changed. And oddly enough, the it is now more attainable, and that it is the college football playoff. So I think that's the it, and ultimately it's been on the table before, just in a different fashion. And I think Kentucky can get there in this new world where, a 9-3 SEC team has every bit of a good of a resume to make it into the college football playoff than any other team out there.
One thing I found interesting, Nick, just in investigating Kentucky before this conversation, almost every publication seems to have different questions going into 2024. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's definitely different. Usually there's at least some overlap. And I guess in this case, that overlap is the schedule, because there are plenty of landmines on an SEC schedule. Maybe we can talk about that. But in terms of position groups, I've seen concerns about quarterback, running back, offensive line, defensive line, cornerback, even the punter. If you had to narrow it down, what are your questions for this team?
I love the punter being thrown in there, because that was an issue. But you can always go find somebody in the portal, and they did. For me, it's kind of lame to go back to the quarterback, but it's such a crapshoot. And when you talk about that it and getting to where you want to go to do things you've never done before, one thing that Mark Stoops has never done is deploy a 3,000-yard passer. I mean, Will Levis was great, and Wan'Dale Robinson broke air raid receiving records. Levis used his legs as well. But, I mean, they still have never had a 3,000-yard passer. There's a lot of uncertainty with offensive coordinator, because I think on the defensive side of things, they're going to, those issues can be mitigated. I mean, Deion Walker is a preseason All-American. They had a great run stuffer already in De'Aaron Jackson, and they bring in Jamon Dumas-Johnson, who was an All-American at Georgia, to play linebacker. And at cornerback, they had a guy who led the SEC in interceptions last year. They got to break in another new guy, but that's doable. So I think a lot of this, when you just look at the depth chart and you see, well, redshirt juniors, redshirt seniors, super seniors, 4 out of 5 starters returning on the offensive line, of receivers with a ton of production. There's a lot there, but that quarterback position is a mystery. Brock Vandagriff, he appears to. It's so hard for Kentucky fans, because you thought going into last year, Devin Leary, best player in the one of the best quarterbacks in the transfer portal, Liam Cohen, NFL offensive coordinator. You think you got the right stuff, and that combination didn't work. You think Brock Vandagriff has the right stuff. He's a former 5-star. He can run it a little bit better. He can add the quarterback run game. But how's this marriage with Bush Hamden, who's been solid, but he's only got a very minimal experience in the SEC, and this schedule is not for the faint of heart. So I do think the quarterback running back combo, what's the production going to be? And that's such a kind of a lame, broad cop-out, but you get used to 1,000-yard rushers in Lexington, and then what happens if you finally got an injury and then you're stuck playing a freshman, or you're stuck going down the line like that? That is the real issue: is can this offense, can it raise it? The floor is high because the defense is good, but how big is the ceiling with Brock Vandagriff and Chip Trayanum from Ohio State at running back?
I want to pull back for a second, just because there is one name that everything flows through with this Kentucky football team, and that's Mark Stoops. Mark Stoops had a chaotic 24 to 48 hours following the Louisville win, and I'm just curious how the vibes are within the locker room, within the program, money behind the scenes, whatever, when you have a coach who starts telling people he's leaving, and then some combination of the school he's leaving for and perhaps the coach himself decide maybe not, and he's coming back, and he loves everybody, and how could he leave? But a few hours earlier, he was telling people, he's like, I'm leaving. How does that manifest itself vibes-wise with a program that has an annual uphill battle, winning a bunch of games in a tough conference?
Oddly enough, it's a very small select few in the fan base who hold that against him.
Okay.
I thought there might be more of that, but you really didn't get much of it because he's been through similar stuff before, never to this extent, right? Where you were that close and you're expecting to wake up and he's the head coach at Texas A&M. But that obviously didn't happen, and I don't think the players, it really affected the locker room that much either, because I mean, this is a pretty transactional. It's pretty clearly transactional in the NIL world, in the transfer portal world. But what I do think it's done from a personal level for Mark Stoops, I saw him after Kentucky lost at South Carolina, and he was sitting on the stoop. No pun intended.
No, it was fully intended. I could sense that. Yeah.
But he was talking to Eddie Gran, who's close confidant, off the field guy, and Stoops just looked beat to hell, man. Like that loss. That was one of those he never thought in 100,000 years. I know it's on the road, but like they should have won that football game, and it took a lot out of him. I think that loss, the kind of chaos around it, I think he had a very hard reset this offseason from all right, I tried some other stuff. We tried, throwing the ball, a bunch of go balls to Barion Brown. We tried to do this pass heavy stuff. Like, no, we're getting back to hard ass Youngstown football, blue collar. We're going to bully you in the trenches. Do they have the personnel to do all this? But I don't know. But at least from a mentality and mindset standpoint, there's a couple of times where they were showing up to SEC media days and, maybe they thought a little too highly of themselves. I think this entire offseason, since that moment, has been about laying low, having a chip on your shoulders, let all these guys not talk about us, let them doubt us, because that's when we're at our best, is when we are being doubted, when we are this, it's us against the world mentality. And I think Stoops is trying to get back to what made him successful when they had that run with 2 9-win seasons in 4 years.
So what's been behind the sort of instability on offense? I think if you count Liam Cohen's 2 different tenures, it's 5 offensive coordinating tenures in as many years. And I think a lot of people look at Mark Stoops as sort of a beacon of stability with how long he's been at Kentucky. And I imagine not many people would question that he's the most successful Kentucky football coach ever. I mean, Bear Bryant, go back to like the 50s or whatever, had a couple big years, but in the modern era, nobody, I don't think, has come close to Mark Stoops. What was behind that sort of instability and always looking and always, trying to figure out what to change on offense and different transfer quarterbacks? Like, what is it that led to Kentucky's offense being on such weird ground?
It is, Brad White's been the defensive coordinator for, I think this might be year 7, which just, normally those guys either get another job, like they get a promotion or go elsewhere. Vince Marrow, the associate head coach, his big recruiting guy, he's been there since day 1. But offensive coordinator has just, like the offense in general, because it's Stoops' biggest shortcoming as a coach. I mean, it just has been. And he initially tried, and it was kind of foisted upon him, but he went the same route as brother Bob went. He went with an air raid guy, Neil Brown, who, did well for what he had, moved on, quickly rose up the ranks. Now he's at West Virginia. But he's always struggled finding an identity. They found one when Gran was hired to be the offense coordinator, and they're like, hey, we're going to run the damn ball. This is going to be us. And then they just hit a hard ceiling. He wasn't good enough as a passer. So Stoops said, how do I find a guy who can give me just enough passing to reach the ceiling, but still incorporate the run stuff? And when he hired Liam Cohen, that was all of the talking points. It was, we're marrying the run and the pass. We're going to do pro style. And it helped them get over this, misconception is not the right word, but it helped them get things right on the recruiting path, and it helped them kind of find an identity. The problem is they were a victim of their own success. They were just a victim of their own success. Cohen bounces, and then you're kind of stuck in February. Do I get another NFL guy? How do these guys figure it out? And now Cohen leaves them again. They've built it up to where they got a guy now in Butch Hamden who he does the pro style, but he's primarily in college. He only dabbled in pro style in the NFL for a year. And they financially kind of locked him in to where the buyout is so large that now if he can't afford it. I mean, his contract, it's worth more if he leaves early than actually he's getting paid. I think it's a $2 million buyout and 1.7 just per year. So financially, they're trying to lock him in. And if Hamden is the right guy to find this right combination, then he might finally get on track. But that goes back to the biggest question we talked about earlier. Is this guy the real deal? Can he provide the answers that this Kentucky offense so desperately needs?
And so last year, you talk about the consistency of Brad White and the consistency of this defense and producing NFL level talent. Last year, the defense takes a pretty major step back. With the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of, putting everything into context, injuries, talent level, coaching, opponents, is this something that Kentucky fans should be sort of scared of moving forward with, obviously the offense doesn't hold up its end of the bargain, which can play a huge role in the defense.
Right.
How do you diagnose that step back from last season?
It's difficult, and it's one of my kind of pet projects. And the more I dig in, the less answers I get. I mean, even, Drew Phillips, dude's a day 2 selection in the NFL draft at one cornerback. The other cornerback, like Max Harrison, leads the SEC in interceptions. How is the pass defense as bad as it is? Right. Some of it you can just say, hey, the safety position, they had some good momentum going into the year. Injuries happen. They're playing a freshman, like that sort of stuff happens. I think the bigger picture issue is maybe more so of hey, they've been playing this sort of style for a while. Other offenses are catching up to what they were doing. So I think there's some legit scheme issues that they have to figure out. But if I'm a Kentucky fan, I'm not as concerned about it because Brad White is a smart guy. He's been doing this job for a long time. He's got a ton of experienced guys. And the biggest issue of them all, I think there was it's hard to have your most vocal leader be a guy who's nose tackle and Deion Walker, who will play some 3 tech, and he does a bunch of different stuff. But you really need that to be an inside linebacker. And Pop Dumas Johnson, that dude looks 35. He commands a room when he comes into it. That's going to be invaluable. Having that experience there, playing in national championship games like that, that's going to be invaluable. So, it's definitely going to be a talking point that we got to address. But I do think that Brad White will figure it out. But I don't think he's going to be able to figure out Tennessee because that is one opponent where they just can't they can't seem to figure out, much to the chagrin of Kentucky football fans.
Nick, let me go back for a second to Brock Vandagriff. Stop me if this is too personal a question, but I just have to ask it.
Ask away.
I get the sense from watching your content that you are equally as excited about Brock Vandagriff as Dan and I are, but maybe a bit tentative about going all in, given the Devin Leary thing didn't really go as expected. Is that a fair assessment of where you stand on Brock Vandagriff?
100%.
Okay.
I mean, from the belt clip with the cell phone on it to the hunting pictures, I did find it odd that he got rid of the flow, but apparently it was because he respects David Cutcliffe, and David Cutcliffe said, if you want to be a winning SEC quarterback, you can't have hair like that. So he's a coachable guy, if nothing else.
Okay.
I am very excited about it, and it sounds so they weren't showing us a ton this spring, right? Like I don't know how accurate he is throwing the ball deep down the field, but I do know that he's been very coachable, grew up in an environment where his dad's coaching. And so I think all of this is kind of set up where he has all the tools. And the biggest one is just having that quarterback run game where 3rd and 5, all else fails, just go move the sticks and let the fight another day. Whereas last year, Kentucky was just incredibly boom or bust. Their explosive play rate was off the charts, but from a down-to-down distance and efficiency standpoint, they were playing in 3rd and 11 all the time. And that's just, you're playing with dynamite, right? So I think Kentucky's going to be a lot more efficient with Brock Vandagriff under center. And a lot of it just comes down to that's a big dude who can run well, and that can really, really aggravate opposing defenses.
It sounds like we've got another Vandagrifter, Dan.
That's what it sounds like to me.
We've got another Vandagrifter here on the Solid Verbal. We appreciate that.
It sounds like Nick is ready to be hurt again. That's what I'm hearing.
Oh, that's college football, baby. That's being a Kentucky football fan.
No doubt about it.
Does he have the receivers to help support him, though, in the passing game? Dan and I did kind of a deep dive on Kentucky football last season at some point around the midway mark. And, I want to say it was drops. I want to say it kind of had the hallmark of a receiving core that was still a little bit green and trying to figure itself out. Where do things stand on that front?
It was a case of the sophomore slumps.
Okay.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. Now, and part of it, too, is they had a former quarterback coaching the receivers. They bring in a guy, Dykel Shorts, who was all-time great at West Virginia, only been in the coaching game for 4 or 5 years. So a little bit more relatable, a little bit more of a straight shooter, kind of hard, I don't want to say hardliner, but not going to beat around the bush. Like, hey, this is how you have to do it, or you're not going to get paid. I think that's ultimately money is a hell of a motivator. And Dane Key and Barion Brown, those guys set UK receiving and reception records, freshman records. They take a step back. Now they got to go make their money, right? They don't want to be in school for another year. They want to catch those nil checks, and they want to catch NFL checks on Sunday. They got to prove it this year. And they got another guy with them in Jamori Macklin, who he had a crazy explosive play rate last year at North Texas. He's a little bit of experience in the SEC, but it's 3 guys who want to be playing on Sundays next year that don't want to be back in college football. I think that will serve as motivation to make sure that they're holding on to the balls, that they don't have one of the worst drop rates in the Southeastern Conference.
Back to Stoops for a second, if I could. There was an exchange, and I'm sure you remember it better than me, an exchange on his radio show back in October where a disgruntled fan called in, right? You know exactly what I'm talking about. A fan calls in, and Stoops voices, I don't think it's wrong to call it frustration. He says, hey, if you're disgruntled, I'm paraphrasing, if you're disgruntled, we can buy players now. Pony up the cash. Give it to our collective. That's how you can help the program. Which at the time, I remember saying to Dan was like a brilliant marketing pitch, because what fan wants to feel like they're being left behind? That maybe worked, maybe didn't. It also, I think, raised the question, at least in our minds, of, hey, does Mark Stoops feel this way too? Does he feel like Kentucky is being left behind on the NIL front? I'm curious what the status is of Kentucky with the money on that side of things, with so much competition elsewhere in the SEC. How does Kentucky stand right now?
It's good enough. I mean, it's never good enough. They always want more money.
Sure.
But John Legend is the uncle of Anthony Brown-Stevens, who will be wide receiver 4 or 5. And they got him in for a concert. The biggest nil donors get to go. They're doing the things that big SEC programs have to do to just be competitive. And when you see how they're able to get players in the transfer portal, Gerald Mincey, an offensive tackle from Tennessee, that guy's not cheap. Jamon Dumas-Johnson, that guy's not cheap. Brock Vandagriff, those guys aren't cheap. So they're competitive enough. I think his frustration is less about nil and maybe where Kentucky stands in there, and is probably more so with just the players' approach to things, right? Where they kind of had they were really leaning into the mercenaries to be the culture guys, and that culture wasn't there last year. And oddly enough, it had I'm telling you guys, the pony up thing did exponentially more damage than the A&M thing. I mean, pony up, at any time something bad happens, pony up gets brought up. I mean, I'm not like that. It's one of those things that some people just, the cavalier mindset. For many people, Stoops was the most relatable millionaire they knew, right? He's this hardworking Youngstown guy. That was the first time where he was kind of like, Calipari a little bit, where it's like, hey, if you don't like it, well, pony up. And to have this wealthy coach who's underperforming for the second straight year tell you that you need to spend more money for him to have success.
So not a good marketing pitch.
It really rubbed people the wrong way, even though it's true. Sure. And a lot of people were like, yeah, that's how this works now. It just, it ticked people off, and I have a feeling we're not going to hear the last of it.
What is, on that topic, what is the feeling about Mark Stoops long term in Lexington? Steve Spurrier has talked about, once you get to about a decade, then it's really tough to sustain a certain amount of focus, a certain amount of enthusiasm. Mark Stoops has now been there a little over a decade in Lexington. Does this seem like a forever job? Does it seem like he is hitting a frustrating wall, not just isolated to the pony up incident, but is there an energy question with Mark Stoops and, giving everything he has still to the Kentucky program?
So I'm trying to workshop this take, but I'm kind of stuck in the middle of it because
let's do it. Let's workshop it together.
Because on one side of my brain, I go through the depth chart, a lot of redshirt sophomores, a lot of redshirt seniors, super seniors, a lot of old guys. They lead the SEC in returning production. He did this little dance, and I think more importantly, he's 56, which I believe is the same age that Bob was when Bob kind of surprisingly retired. Maybe this is he's trying to tee things up for the next guy to have success, and he wants to go out with one more bang. But then on the other hand, if you're willing to go to Texas A&M, you want to be in this for 5 more years at least, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm struggling on which is it, the devil or the angel? Is the potential jump to A&M more of a sign that he's got some more fuel and fire to try to give it one more go? Or is this let's just have our house in order so that I can unload this, I can make money off my bourbon company, I can retire happily as the winningest coach ever in Lexington? I'm struggling with this one, guys.
Well, forgive me for asking the same question, I think, for the 10,000th time within Kentucky football. But, what is the status of oxygen in the Kentucky athletic department with John Calipari gone? And obviously, so much focus, an overwhelming amount of focus is going to be on Rupp. And you have this Kentucky football program that is outperforming modern history with Mark Stoops. Calipari is gone. So there's the force of personality, all of the oxygen with that tenure is gone. Is that an opportunity for football? Is there renewed interest in basketball because of, a new face running things after so much frustration? What is the dynamic like after that back and forth now that Mark Stoops has sort of won that war for attention for the time being?
Well, and when he's trying to keep a low profile this offseason, it certainly helps that people aren't like, why isn't Stoops doing any interviews? It's like, well, nobody cares because they're wondering who Mark Pope's going to get next. So in the immediate, it helps him in that regard. But I think there was certainly some exhaling, knowing that, okay, yes, we know that basketball is always going to be a big deal here, but we're not in this ongoing battle over personality. Stoops is the big guy on campus right now. Mark Pope has to prove it. And at least from who is in the right ears financially from boosters to administration, the football team's sitting pretty comfortably right now. But it was when they had that John Legend concert and Mark Pope shows up to kind of say hi and be nice, and you're having the football coach and the basketball coach take a picture together. It's like, well, you won't find many of the last two sitting together. I think you had to go back to 2017 to find one of those. So it's different. It's certainly different.
So obviously something Calipari knows, and obviously all Kentucky fans know who pay attention to any sport, is you're kind of only as good as the talent you bring in. The football team has succeeded in some respects in bringing in talent via the portal, and I think in some years out-recruit expectations football-wise under Mark Stoops. What is the state of recruiting? And the portal's obviously been pretty kind football-wise. What is the status of high school recruiting for Mark Stoops in Kentucky? And is that a show of anything positive or negative for the near term?
I don't think it's you're coaching until you don't have your job anymore. That's part of the job. You're going to keep recruiting until they tell you not to. But Stoops has done well in this cycle in particular where the last few, we've seen the calendar kind of move up where June is becoming so much more important. And the last 2 years, it would be July 4th. And you're like, hey, a lot of these guys have 15 commitments, 20 commitments already. We're all of our guys. they're ahead of schedule now. Martell's Carter, top-ranked player in the state. In some sites, he committed over the weekend. 4-star guy, third 4-star. He joined Keith Davis, a top 200 player from I believe Cleveland, if I'm not mistaken. Who it was Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio State, Kentucky. That's a big recruiting win for them. They got a 4-star receiver from Ohio. So when the state of Ohio has good players, that works well for Vince Marrow. He earns that $1.2 million by getting those guys, and then the state of Kentucky's got. I mean, they've struggled to recruit quarterbacks. Well, they got a 4-star that came out last year in Cutter Boley. So I think it's all in all, like getting top 15 classes is just not going to happen here. But they're consistently getting top 25 classes. Talent acquisition has not. It's not an issue for this program.
So it's sort of full circle. And when you look at what Kentucky has going for it, and you look around the SEC. Who does Kentucky currently measure itself against? Who is the aspirational program that Kentucky said, if we can get to where Ole Miss is, if we can get to where Tennessee is, just in terms of whatever it is, consistency, quality, firepower, recruiting, whatever, like what is that next rung? It's not Georgia. What is the next rung for Kentucky to hit?
A big reason why last year stung so much for many Kentucky fans is they watched Missouri do what we expected Kentucky to do the previous year, where the schedule's there, they're 7th in the country, they get under center to throw the game-winning touchdown to Barion Brown, and they got a penalty, right? And then things unravel from that point forward. That type of season for Missouri, where you're kind of middling, but then you have those big flashes where you can go to a New Year's Six game. And I think, to kind of lead this whole thing off, you can go to a college football playoff now. That's where Kentucky wants to get. That's where they're aspiring to be. But they've been stubbing their toe against the Missouris and the South Carolinas of the world. How Kentucky was able to get to that plateau of 9 wins a season here and there, it was beating Missouri, beating South Carolina, beating Vanderbilt regularly. Now, I know it's different equations without divisions and the schedule's different, but having that plateau, I think it's like you said, you can't really become the next Georgia. But to your point, like Ole Miss and Lane, I mean, I don't think we're expecting Ole Miss to be national championship contenders, but they're going to be regular playoff contenders. I don't know if regular playoff contenders there, but that one off every 3 years or so. We've got a little taste of it as Kentucky fans, and I think the big fear is that you would have had all of this success in the Mark Stoops era, but without that ultimate payoff. The Citrus Bowl is great, but it's not the same as New Year's Six college football playoff.
So to you, is it moments? Is that what Kentucky just needs to win more of? That if I were to tell you that Kentucky is 40% better in key third downs in the red zone, that even though they're not overwhelming, even though it's not a top 10 national offense, that if they're winning 4 of 10 moments more often, then I don't know if that math checks out. I might have just said something that makes no sense.
They're going to hit rewind.
But you know what I'm saying.
Do the math for you and then write in to tell you were wrong.
Whatever their current rate of big moment success is, you up that by about 40%. You think that that'll change the complexion for most teams, but you think that's what it comes down to for Kentucky.
It's 100% of it. If you look at the 7-6 seasons of the last 2 years, they're 2-6 in SEC home games. You gotta win at home, right? Like you can't make mistakes in end of game situations, like they did against Clemson in the bowl game, like they did against Tennessee, at South Carolina in that game that wiped out Stoops. They've got the ball inside the 50-yard line with 1:20 left. Just go win the game. Don't throw an interception on the very first snap. Like it's those sort of mistakes, the lack of execution down the stretch, situational football. I mean, even when you're Kentucky, you're playing with a thin margin of error. So you cannot have self-inflicted mistakes, and they've had way too many of those in recent years, and a lot of it is just as simple as executing when you got the hand, right? Like, you get dealt a pretty good hand, like, don't blow this. You play your cards right, win the hand, and live to die another day.
Yeah, the joke Ty and I make is like your team either has or doesn't have Excelsior, right? A series of plays in the last 4 minutes that your team is crazy confident in running and executing correctly. And you watch teams that have that moment and are just, they don't have an Excelsior to turn to. And it does seem like there are always going to be those 7 to 8 teams in any given conference. There's like, well, they didn't have a plan there at all. And that does feel like where Kentucky's been.
I mean, last year, Missouri, they aren't what they are if Mevis doesn't make that kick. If the thicker kicker doesn't just bail out drink and hit a 61-yarder. And you need a little bit of luck. But also some of it is just being ready for that moment. Kentucky's just been too sloppy. And that's why I go back, you asked about talent acquisition. Now it's on the coaches, right? Like you've got the roster, you've got the players. I don't think fans are going to be blaming them if they come up short. It's all following on the coaches' shoulders this year, and that goes back to the kind of longevity with Stoops thing. This will be the first time in a while that he's not going to have as much rope from the fan base. The benefit of the doubt, it hasn't completely eroded, but people are going to be much quicker to point the finger at him this fall when things don't go according to plan.
So full circle, if this season is simulated 100 times, in how many of those simulations are you leaving the season saying the coaches figured it out?
73 of them.
Okay.
I'm pretty confident that this is going to be a quality Kentucky football team that's a hard out. And, if things go according to plan, I can see the college football playoff rankings come out. There's 2 weeks left in the season, and Kentucky's a top 25 team going down to Texas, and people are saying, Texas, the SEC's there for the taking, but they can't slip up against Kentucky. And so you have a potential, it'll probably be an 8-4 season where, or 8-4, 7-5, where they beat a team that they shouldn't. And maybe it's Ole Miss on the road. But then they slip up and stub their toe against a team that they shouldn't lose to, and maybe that's an Auburn at home. That week 2 game though against South Carolina, that's the season right there. If you want to get where you want to go, they're breaking in a new quarterback who's in his second year as a primarily running guy. You're at home, 3:30 kickoff. You've lost 2 in a row to Shane Beamer. I can't stand that guy. Many Kentucky fans cannot stand that guy. When he did the sunglasses, it just it rubbed our nose in it. I mean you got to win that game. There's no excuses. So if you win that game, then it opens up pathways where, if you lose some of those games on the road, when you lose to Georgia at home, people aren't going to be too mad. They'll think you've got it figured out as long as you go and beat one of those teams you shouldn't. Maybe a Tennessee that's been so elusive for Stoops throughout his tenure.
And if you want to beat South Carolina, you know what you have to do. Pony up. You always pony up. Pony up. That's what I heard.
That's what
I've been hearing. Okay, final question. In the next 5 years, this is an easy yes/no question. Well, it might not be easy, but there are only 2 answers here. Do we get a shot of Kentucky learning that they are one of 12 or 4 teams to make the college football playoff, and one of those live ESPN shots in like a cafeteria?
Yes, couches will burn. It'll be a glorious moment. And I think my path to it is Stoops retires in 3 years. John Summerall, who's a former player, won 2 Sun Belts at Troy. Now he's at Tulane. He does well enough there. They bring him home. They keep things relatively simple. And he brings a lot of pop right away. And that's how Kentucky gets there. In 2030, 2029, they'll be the 14 seed traveling to Oregon in the first round of the college football playoff
with John Summerall. So it might not happen for Mark Stoops, but it will happen for Kentucky.
It's in our future, and it's going to be a glorious, surreal experience for Kentucky football fans that suffered through so many 2-win seasons. That we've seen some stuff. We've been kicked by Steve Spurrier, by Phil Fulmer, Kirby Smart. Yep. Our time to shine is right around the corner.
Ty, I'm writing this down, May 29th, 2024. We will go back in 2029 and review this episode as we are all enslaved by AI robots of the future. But I will make note of it.
We'll
still have the receipts to show our artificial intelligence overlords that Nick knew way back when. Nick Roush, Kentucky Sports Radio, thank you so much for all of your time. And please follow him. Please listen to him for all things Kentucky sports.
It's been a pleasure being on the Solid Verbal, guys. I appreciate it.
All right, one more time, Nick Roush. Check him out across really anywhere on the internet. Kentucky Sports Radio is out there, man. They've been fighting the good fight since like 2005. They predate our podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said at the top, they are the gold standard for all things Kentucky. They do an awesome job, and Nick is, of course, included on that staff. We're privileged to have him on the show. Mark Stoops is getting $9 million a year.
Yes, he is.
Did not mention that in our talk with Nick, but $9 million a year. He took over a program that was not very good. I think he has brought an element of stability to Lexington, which is definitely the secret sauce in this day and age of college football. You need stability. If you don't have it, it's not going to work long term.
You're using my theory.
I am. No, I think your theory is correct. Where it needs to go next,
stability. Yeah.
Where it needs to go next is, as Nick described, win some of those moments.
Yeah.
Be a little bit more efficient on offense. Despite all of Stoops' success, 2 10-win seasons in the decade plus that he's been in Lexington, and now back-to-back 6-loss seasons.
Mm-hmm.
Something's got to change. Something's got to change in this era where you don't have the divisions, where the path into the playoff is a little bit wider. Just a few of those rough edges. Sand those off, make things run a little bit more smoothly, and then we're talking. Now, the schedule, I can talk through the schedule if you want. The schedule is always going to make that a bit of an uphill fight, but it seems to me after this conversation with Nick that some of the stuff with Kentucky that needs to change is fairly obvious.
So it's interesting. Kentucky, and we talked about this a little bit, like 5 different offensive coordinating tenures. That's kind of sort of like a weird, stretchy way that I put it, with, separate Liam Cohen tenures. And I thought it was a little bit conflicting when he mentioned, and this isn't like saying something about Nick that he's not here to defend, when he's talking about like the dual threat upside of Brock Vandagriff, but also Mark Stoops wants to get back to just like bruising, running in what worked before. And that gives me some pause. When a defensive head coach is like, I want to get back to how my offense existed to serve the defense and control clock. And anytime we hear that, and it's worked for some teams when that's like the core ideology, and we saw Jim Harbaugh sort of get back to that at Michigan. But I think with the talent level, and Kentucky's had very good offensive lines, don't get me wrong, but an overall talent level at quarterback and running back that I don't think Kentucky has always had, that's concerning to me, that there might be this sort of conflicting vision that like, well, you're not really taking advantage of Brock Vandagriff's strengths, and you're going back to like serving the defense, and like, why are we losing this game 20-17 every week? That gives me a little bit of, your favorite pet charity cause for pause. So curious to see how Bush Hamden plays a role. Good with Boise for the most part last year as a Chris Peterson, as coach with like, I think Sark as well. Mizzou kind of immediately got better when they moved on from him to Kirby Moore, as did kind of that entire offense. And so I am curious about what the marriage looks like on offense for Kentucky, because that's the whole thing. That's when you have those end of game issues. That's when you have sort of confusion with 2.5 minutes left. And so if they're aligned offensively this year and the defense improves, which I think it will, they have that chance to be Utah-ish in the SEC. If you're flawed, Kentucky will beat you. If you're pretty good, Kentucky might beat you. If you're excellent, Kentucky's going to give you fits. I think is the ceiling right now for Kentucky. It's a good ceiling.
There are 5 very losable games on this schedule.
That's tough.
They include Georgia, who they play 3rd week of the season, at home in Lexington, which is good, but it's still Georgia. On the road to close out September against Ole Miss. In the month of November, there's a road game at Tennessee. There's a road game at DKR against Texas, and then they close out the year back home for the Governor's Cup.
Yeah, Governor.
against Louisville. That does not include games against South Carolina, who we mentioned in the interview. They've lost their last 2. Does not include a road tilt in the Swamp, middle of October. Don't know what version of Florida we're going to find middle of October, but tough place to play, loud place to play. Mm-hmm. Auburn, I think Auburn should be improved this season, and that's a game maybe in a look-ahead spot a week before that Tennessee road tilt that I mentioned earlier. So this is not easy by any stretch of the imagination. As Nick said, you got to try and win as many of these home games as you can because the home road splits right now at time of recording in late May do not look promising.
And I just assume they're playing an incredibly tough non-conference schedule like Kentucky. I can't get through that sentence.
Southern Miss,
Ohio, and Murray State.
Murray State, yeah. And Louisville.
And Louisville, right. They always have that.
Sure.
But yeah, that's sort of Kentucky's MO to be like the modern day old early Bryles Baylor, where it's just like they're playing a school called what? Kentucky typically does not schedule in that way, which I guess, if you're going to get to 8-9 wins at Kentucky.
This is a tough slate one way or another.
And the SEC only gets more difficult with Oklahoma and Texas. They don't have Oklahoma this year, right?
They do not. No.
They have Texas in Austin, which should be very difficult near the end of the year. One of the more watchable programs, because when you lose in entertaining ways, you keep watching, I guess.
You keep watching, and also, and I'll close on this.
Yeah.
Especially in this new era of college football, where, again, top 12 get into the playoff. A lot more is decided on the margins.
Mm-hmm.
We've had this instance, maybe last year was a bad example, but we've had this instance more often than not when it comes to talking about the playoff, where it's pretty cut and dry who those top four are going to be. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room at the top. We sort of know going into the weekend, and especially after the games have been played, who's getting in and who isn't. But now, when we're talking about 12 teams, Kentucky, which finds itself in that position to be a pain in the ass.
Mm-hmm.
Worst case scenario, a pain in the ass. Best case scenario, a team that can knock you off. Teams like Kentucky are the ones that I think hold many other futures in their grasp. And so that will make them even more interesting than they've been. I'm always interested in Kentucky. You know what I said at the top. I'm going to fully commit to the bit here. I'm certain of it in July when we do the SEC preview.
They're one of the all-time, under Mark Stoops, Kentucky. I never thought about this until actually Nick was talking about it. They're a great all-time cut-in team. Cut-in-tucky. Right?
Time.
Where Kevin Nagandi starts with weird finish in the Kentucky blah game. Kentucky all-time Nagandi squad. That's their identity right now. Weird finish in the Kentucky-Mizzou game, which there always is, by the way. Weird finish in Kentucky-South Carolina. Weird finish Kentucky-Florida. They're an all-time cut-in Hall of Fame program.
Who are some other Nagandi teams? That's a great
the Nagandis? That'll be our award show at the end of the year. I don't even know if Kevin Nagandi does cut-ins anymore. Whoever it is. It used to be like Cassidy Hubbarth. Who are the all-time weird finish teams? Okay. Mizzou for a stretch. Even last year, Mizzou had some weird, like the end of the LSU game, the end of the Kansas State game, where like, let's go real quick to Columbia. Weird finish in the Mizzou game. Weird finish teams. Maybe Purdue on a certain level with some of those upsets.
Well, Purdue being the spoiler makers,
yeah.
I mean, they definitely fall into that category. I feel like we have one or two Northwestern-related games a year where there's just like, it's not necessarily a cut-in.
Weird score at halftime.
A weird halftime score where you see it on the bottom line and wonder, like, that's interesting.
Northwestern giving Penn State all it can handle in Evanston. Yeah. And then Penn State wins 42-14, but it's 10-9 or something at halftime.
Yeah.
Northwestern fits that. Florida State the past few years has played down to a bunch of teams, even though last year was a super successful year.
Oh, dude, Syracuse. We got to throw Syracuse in here, right?
Syracuse all-time cut-in team. Oregon State, I would add.
Syracuse, Oregon State have been Nagandi teams since the jump. Even since before Kevin Nagandi got to ESPN. They feel like they're always those kind of teams where they find, because it's a weird place to play or who knows what, they're always kind of lurking. Yeah.
I think it's actually a lot of the teams we've talked about in this series, not to plug our own show on our own show, like Oklahoma State with Spencer Sanders. Weird ending in Stillwater. Like, I think that's what has kind of kept a lot of these teams away from actually happening, is the inability to close. What do we call them? The Peter North teams you don't have that powerful finish. And so, we're actually dealing with a Nagandi series right now is what we're doing.
Yeah. All right. Well, big thanks to Nick Roush again from Kentucky Sports Radio. Does an awesome job covering all things Kentucky sports. Obviously quite knowledgeable. we'll bring him back on at some point in the future to get his take on where things stand with the Wildcats. In the meantime, make sure you hit follow, make sure you hit subscribe wherever it is you're finding us now, be it on any of your podcasting apps or YouTube, you name it. Hit the button so that you don't miss any of our stuff. We are going strong twice a week through most of the off season. At some point in July, we'll flip it over to 3 a week as we get closer to the start of the year. We, of course, have much more to discuss over the next few episodes, not the least of which is college football, the structure of which changing fairly rapidly, given perhaps an agreement between the power conferences and the NCAA and the students and the student athletes. And there's a lot to talk about on that front. We've got details that are coming out hot and heavy about the upcoming video game that I know a lot of people are excited about. So
Leisure Suit Larry is what I
Leisure
assume.
Suit Larry, of course.
Yeah, the new era. Yeah.
This has not been an off-season void of content. As we get into June here, we're going to see things pick up. I've been saying that for a while. So
I'm gonna message Kevin Nagandi real quick to come on the show.
Message Kevin, see if you can get him on.
Yeah.
All right. Big thanks again to Nick. Big thanks again to our Verballerhood out there. Check us out by hitting follow or subscribe, or of course going to verballers.com for our bonus content and ad-free episodes. For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein, for myself, Ty Hildenbrand, thank you for downloading, for listening, for supporting. We'll talk to you all soon. Stay solid.
Peace.